My granddad used a Ouija board in the 70s, and my family has been severely haunted ever since. Growing up, my family was always interested in horror movies, paranormal investigation TV shows, books about the supernatural, etc. I figured this was because the house we were living in was haunted. My mom and grandparents were extremely open about this. So as a child, I was aware what ghosts and poltergeists were, just as casually as I knew about Santa and the Tooth Fairy. However, the more I've learned about my family as I've gotten older, the more I believe it is the other way around. My family isn't interested in the supernatural because we were haunted by it. No, we are haunted because of our interest in the supernatural. Specifically, my granddad Bill. Yes, thanks to him. He's dead now, passed away from cancer nearly 10 years ago. My Annie, Mum, siblings and me were pestered, unnerved, and at times absolutely petrified by the goings-on of unseen forces in not only my childhood home, but the homes of my grandparents, and etc. Honestly, it makes a lot more sense why, when I was young and my school friends would talk about ghosts and tell spooky stories, they either didn't have a haunted house or thought they maybe did and that was it, and yet not only was my house haunted, but pretty much everyone in my family was. I used to really hold back and censor myself during these storytelling sessions, in case people thought I was crazy, or even worse, lying. I used to think, what are the chances? And how unlucky is it that all my family members just happen to move into houses that are so alive with activity from the dead? Now, I know that it isn't the houses which are haunted, but the people who inhabit them. And it all started in the 1970s, when my mom was a teenager, my Annie was a child, and my Joyce and granddad Bill were a young married couple just starting out in their new home, in a small town just outside of Edinburgh, Scotland. Bill was always eccentric and zany. Even my memories of him as a young child are him telling me that the small TM at the end of some words in magazines stood for toe monster, and when you saw the small TM, the toe monster would appear at the end of your bed that night to steal your toes. However, you could defeat it by holding up a teaspoon and letting the toe monster see its own reflection, thus making it surrender. He was always very interested in the idea of extraterrestrials and was writing a book which he never finished, though did try to get published in the 90s but was told he needed to dumb it down. My brother inherited this manuscript when Bill died, and my brother reminds me of Bill in a lot of ways when it comes to their interests and intellect. Bill was extremely intelligent, and he was a weirdo, but in a really fun way. Fun until it wasn't. Unbeknownst to my when she was raising their two daughters and Bill was upstairs reading and writing, he was also dabbling in some experimentation with a homemade Ouija board. I know all of this, and all of the other events to come in this series, from what my and other relatives have told me. Strangely enough, my also had one experience with an Ouija board when she was little, in science class of all places. Their science teacher brought in a Ouija board, and my who was raised quite religious and was also very young, didn't like this and found it quite scary, especially when the pointer began to move around the board. It was a split boys/girls school, so she and the girls around the board just sort of laughed nervously or said nothing as it moved around and randomly spelled the name Daniel. For years, that name meant nothing, but my would have an encounter where that name came back into focus in an extremely jarring and traumatizing way. So that was in the 50s, forward again to the 70s, and my is raising two daughters whilst working as a manger in a bakery whilst they're at school, and my granddad is being weird and intellectual in his spare time, but working night shifts as a security guard. The event I'm going to tell you about is where the saga with my family and the paranormal truly begins. My had put my mom and aunt to bed and settled in her own bed, eventually drifting off to sleep. My granddad would often just sleep on the couch after getting home from his security night shifts, so not to wake up my or he'd stay up to do some writing. So Bill had come home from one of his security shifts at the local shopping center, and he was downstairs, knowing his wife and kids were upstairs asleep, when all of a sudden he heard a terrified screaming coming from my Without skipping a beat, he bounded upstairs, and even my mom and aunt had woken up and run out of their bedroom. My granddad held them back and went into the master bedroom, where my was still screaming, sitting up in the bed, leaning to the other side as if trying to keep away from something, but nothing was there. My granddad, assuming she'd had a really bad nightmare, asked her what it was, and he did not expect her to say what she did. She was quite religious, and at the time was not a believer or even a thinker of things paranormal or supernatural. And yet this night changed all of that. I'm sure much to the delight of Bill, who had always been interested in those things. My told Bill that she had woken from sleep, having heard Bill coming in the front door from work, and when she opened her eyes, in the corner of the dark bedroom was a black shadowy figure. At first my thought she was seeing things, so she stared at it longer and harder, allowing her eyes to adjust to the darkness. When her eyes did adjust, she could not believe what she was seeing. Now when my talks about this, every single time without fail, she gets goosebumps, and the first time she ever told me the story, she genuinely had a lump in her throat and tears in her eyes. This is not a woman recounting a nightmare. This is a woman recounting something she saw in the supposed safety and privacy of her own bedroom in her own home, and how it changed her outlook on everything. In the corner of the room, masked in shadow, on its knees in a kneeling position, was a tall, broad-shouldered man, whom my describes as looking as if he was made of stone, gray-skinned, and covered with a pale, yellow tunic of sorts. His face, again looking as if it was not only made of stone, but looked carved, she described as looking like something halfway between an actual human face and an Easter Island head, with a large nose, large ears, a wide, tall forehead, big lips tightly held shut, and almost rectangular stretched dark black voids where eyes should be. She made out this amount of detail and knew exactly what she could see. She was staring at it in silent shock, but had no idea who or what it was. Before she had time to think anything else, and without it moving a muscle, it began to slide across the floor towards her, still on its knees. Without a sound, and with no movement from its legs, arms, head. In the kneeling position, it slowly approached my gran, who was frozen in terror in her bed. It got to the side of her bed, mere inches away, towering over her. My gran looked up at this disturbing concrete-looking figure, and she described how with one swift movement, its torso seemed to pivot in order to look down at her directly. Almost face to face, my gran said that the long black holes where eyes would be suddenly lit with a pulsating red glow. Then, as if that wasn't horrific enough, in a deep, thunderous voice, which did not come from its unmoving stone lips clenched tightly together, my gran heard in her head almost telepathically the word Daniel. It was with the glowing red eyes and the voice in her head that she screamed, unable to take any more and unfrozen from her petrified state. When she had finished recounting this, my granddad couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even as a believer, he'd never even seen anything like that, let alone would have expected his wife to state she had. My gran slept in her daughter's bedroom that night, and every night after until they moved, which she told Bill they'd be doing as soon as possible. My gran kept her eye out for the next available house in the area, and my mom actually came across a house for sale on her way home from school one day, which is where they moved to, and is the house my gran still lives in today. Sadly, moving wasn't the solution she thought it was going to be. And sadly, this wasn't quite the end of the Stone Man encounters. My gran's mom, my great-gran, would babysit for a bit of money, and through pure coincidence she began babysitting for a young couple who had just bought a house in the area. The house that her own daughter and son-in-law had basically just fled from after what her daughter had seen. My great-gran didn't say this to the couple though, not wanting to scare them or make them not want to hire her. And as a religious woman herself, she honestly, but quietly, thought her daughter had just had a nightmare and massively overreacted in selling the house. So one day, a few weeks after she'd started babysitting for the couple, as my gran and great-gran are having tea in my gran's new house, my gran thinks her mom is being quieter than usual. She asks what is wrong, but my great-gran seems a bit cagey, not wanting to say what was wrong. Knowing her mom, my gran persisted, and eventually my great-gran confessed what had been eating away at her. My great-gran had been in the old house babysitting the little boy and girl while the parents were out working. She asked them how they were enjoying living in this town, and if they'd made friends at their school. The little girl replied, and my great-gran's blood ran cold. The little girl said that she had made a best friend. My great-gran said that was brilliant, and asked if they lived near. The little girl said he lived upstairs. My great-gran, assuming it was an imaginary friend, just rolled her eyes and asked what he was like. The little girl said that he was made of stone and would play with her in her bedroom, then would go home into her mummy and daddy's bedroom through the wall. My great-gran was speechless. When she told my gran about this, my gran felt sick. Eventually, years later, my gran found out that Bill had been using a Ouija board in that first home of theirs, and Bill had become obsessive in his writings and studies, to the point of being a bit absent as a father, and they eventually got a divorce. The marriage wasn't working anymore, although they still remained good friends. And even when Bill moved out, he got a small flat only a few streets away. Like I said, moving didn't actually help, and although my gran never saw the Stone Man again, the house they moved into would prove to be even more eventful. And due to her spirituality, my gran feels my granddad opened up a doorway to beings and energies that came through to this realm, attached to my family, and haven't gone back to where they came from. I don't blame her for being a bit pissed off. Not only was she terrified, but her kids and then grandkids would be terrified and terrorized. But then again, her science teacher had her dabble in it too all those years ago. My gran went on to meet another man who she'd later marry, and he's a really great and very normal guy. His name, believe it or not, is Daniel. More to come, much more.